Without making excuses for her behavior, we need to understand that hooking up is the dating norm on many college campuses, and these casual encounters do lead to babies, an outcome that always surprises college students because they've been taught since they were 10 that sex has nothing to do with babies, and as long as one is using some form of contraception, babies won't happen. But the pressures on most college girls to abort are huge, and they come from every direction. The boyfriend typically was not looking for a lifetime commitment or 18 years of child support payments. He just wanted a good time. In fairness, there are many young men who want to do the right thing and can be devastated by the loss of their child to abortion. But friends encourage her to get it over with. It's not really a baby, just cells. It's quickly done, no one needs to know. She's probably terrified of telling her parents and siblings because being single in college and pregnant is synonymous with being hugely irresponsible. Even her body is pressuring her to take a quick action to remove the threat. In a panic mode, our limbic system just overwhelms our thoughts. The same hormones that trigger the fight or flight response take over, put her in a panic mode, basically disengaging the cerebral cortex where she could reason. This is not a state of mind that's conducive to moral decision-making. And against all this pressure, the only thing the baby has going for it is that God has hardwired moms to love their children without measure, a love so profound, so miraculous, that any normal mom who's ever looked into her child's eyes would unquestionably give up her life for that child. That's why the way that we can substantially reduce abortions among college-age students is fairly simple. Find a way for the mom to see her baby on ultrasound. I talked a few weeks ago to a handful of directors of pregnancy care centers who, thanks to the initiative of the Knights of Columbus, now have very high-resolution ultrasounds. Everyone reported that 85 to 90% of the moms who see their baby on ultrasound decide against abortion. Well, Courtney was lucky. She knew she was carrying a baby, her baby, and she sought help from a pregnancy care counselor and the support of her parents, and she made an adoption plan so that her baby could be raised in a loving two-parent family. Of course, in the later months of pregnancy, Courtney grew very close to her son, and it was very painful to let him go. But she knew her choice would give him the best start in life, and she's never regretted the decision. Loving without measure, doing the right thing, becomes even harder when we are faced with sacrificing our savings, perhaps all our waking hours, and caring for an elderly relative, especially one who's debilitated, slowly dying, cognitively impaired, or even just crabby. Today, our cultural elites, the folks in government, academia, news, entertainment, media, who dictate the tastes and moral norms of our society, today this ruling class opposes even ordinary efforts to sustain the lives of the dying and impaired. Self-styled bioethicists give primarily three arguments in favor of euthanasia and assisted suicide. The first is personal autonomy. A billboard of the Final Exit group reads, "My life, my death, my choice." This is a charming group that does house calls for people to help them find ways to commit suicide. Patient autonomy, the right to refuse burdensome or excessive treatment, is co-opted as a reason for the kids to consent to euthanizing mom and dad because they, quote, wouldn't have wanted to live like that or be a burden on them, unquote. The second argument is to end the suffering of those who are dying, and it's generally presented with real or hypothetical horror stories of family members who suffered greatly, apparently because their MDs were ignorant of the modern methods of palliative care. Today, it's very rare for a dying person to have intractable pain that cannot be relieved. Sometimes, though rarely, near the end of life, a patient can be put into a coma-like state of sedation, as is done with severe trauma patients or burn victims. But many people find these two arguments, patient autonomy and end of suffering, compelling. But Hemlock's founder, Derek Humphrey, explains that a different factor is going to usher in the acceptability of assisted suicide and euthanasia in the United States. He said, quote, "The increasing cost of health care in an aging society, economics, not the quest for broadened individual liberties or increased autonomy, will drive assisted suicide to the plateau of acceptability." And Obamacare is certainly going to speed that along. The vignette in the flyer features a couple, Annette and Carl, whose dad, Stanley, has been diagnosed in a persistent vegetative state after sustaining a brain injury from a fall at home. Stanley needed nursing home care, which they were able and glad to provide, but he wasn't getting enough food by mouth, and the doctors said he was unlikely ever to recover consciousness. So the question they faced was this: do we sustain his life indefinitely with assisted nutrition hydration, or do we face the reality that he's not really living except biologically and has a rather low quality of life? His continued existence is no longer a source of happiness to him, or a good, philosophically speaking. Well, that, of course, is the wrong question. Simply put, the question is it morally permissible to have a member of your family killed to avoid the personal sacrifice his or her care requires? The answer must be no, for the sake of the vulnerable human being, but perhaps even more importantly, for our own sake. In his allocution in March 2004 to a conference on persistent vegetative state, Pope John Paul observed, I quote him, "Even our brothers and sisters who find themselves in the clinical condition of a vegetative state retain their human dignity in all its fullness. The loving gaze of God the Father continues to fall upon them, acknowledging them as his sons and daughters, especially in need of help." End quote. We simply have no right to take the lives of innocent human persons. Murder is murder, whatever the motive. And a civilization cannot survive an ethic that tolerates the murder of innocent people. Now, why do I say that we must love patients with severe cognitive impairments more for our own sake than for theirs even? John Paul and Benedict have both spoken movingly about the nature of the human person and the meaning of human life. Humans by nature exist dependent on and in relation to others. Our vocation is to love. John Paul put it this way: the meaning of life is found in giving and receiving love. Benedict has said the vocation to love is the key to our entire existence. And if this is true, we must learn to love well, or we have failed the entire purpose of our lives. The truth is, we will not be fit for heaven unless and until we have learned to love one another as God loves us, with a full measure of love, as he radically demonstrated on the cross. And if we don't learn to love sacrificially during our lifetime, we may lose heaven altogether. We will also make life on earth hellish for ourselves and for others. Let me quote Dr. William May from a column he wrote earlier this year called "On Being a Burden to One's Family." And I quote, "If we succeed in pushing away everyone who is dependent, then we're left with ourselves, our egocentric, sin-rationalizing, defensive, irritable, and vain selves. If we never learn to give until it hurts, till the painful reality that we're not the center of the universe sinks in, we will fail at marriage, at parenthood, at citizenship, and even simple neighborliness. Our community will become a marketplace of the physically strong but the morally weak." So you see, it's not for their sake, but for our own and for the sake of civilization itself that we must care for these inconvenient lives. You'd think that the medical profession would understand this well, but possibly because the tort bar is making a financial killing suing doctors on behalf of patients when a child is born with a disability, and because every payout for malpractice increases the doctor's premiums until he can no longer practice obstetrics, many OBs are putting enormous pressure on patients to abort babies diagnosed in utero with a genetic anomaly. This is true even when the conditions are manageable and even correctable. Approximately 90% of the children diagnosed in utero with Down syndrome don't make it out alive. But today, with early intervention strategies and a more supportive environment for those with disabilities, people with Down syndrome can live happy, productive lives well into their 50s. Children are also being aborted for correctable conditions as trivial as a cleft palate. If ultrasound had been available 91 years ago, I would not be standing before you today, because my mother was born with only one hand, her left arm ended about there, and one kidney. If that had been detected, today's OB would say, go ahead and abort the child, you can have another perfect baby later. She ended up being a concert pianist as a teenager, traveling all over the country. Met my dad on a USO tour, married, raised 4 kids, and continued to teach piano until just this May, over a dozen students still a week, doing the Sunday New York Times crossword puzzles, emailing friends around the country at almost 90, has lived a very, very fulfilling life. And as I said, I wouldn't be here today, so I'm grateful that there was no ultrasound then. In the flyer, Barbara and Jack welcomed their little daughter Joy into the world against the advice of their doctor. Babies with trisomy 13 may die in the womb, and only 1 in 5 survive to their first birthday. Loving a child like that is bittersweet, but it brings out the very best in families. They learn what it means to be a family, to love, rejoice, and suffer together. So with these examples of loving without measure fresh in our minds, let's peer for a moment into the darkness. Benjamin Weicker, who is a professor at University of Steubenville, Franciscan University, wrote an article for Crisis magazine in 2004 called "The Death of Morality." He identifies the real moral crisis of our day as this, quote, that we, among all human beings who have ever lived, face the end of morality as such. What he means by this is the rejection of human nature itself. I want to spend just a couple of minutes presenting some facts and statements which richly demonstrate that morality itself is now on life support. And to quote Pope John Paul II in the Gospel of Life, only the concerted efforts of all those who believe in the value of life can prevent a setback of unforeseeable consequences for civilization. Let's start with the end of life. In the Netherlands, the Dutch stopped prosecuting euthanasia in 1973 and formally legalized mercy killing in 2002. In the beginning, MDs terminated the lives of terminally ill patients who asked for it, and then the chronically ill who asked for it, and then people with disabilities who asked for it, and then the depressed who asked for it. And now they don't even wait to be asked if the patient or his children thinks it's time for him to go. Some 800 to 900 people have died without request or consent at the hands of their doctors. 8% of children who are killed in their cribs by their doctors because of disabilities, often now without even asking the parents. This year, more than 100,000 Dutch citizens signed a petition to their parliament to engage in a debate to change the law to let healthy people over 70 be euthanized if they are, quote unquote, tired of life. In Belgium, even nurses are committing euthanasia without request or consent, and now it's been coupled with organ harvesting, so we can see where that's leading. Officially reported deaths from euthanasia increased 40% between 2008 and 2009 to 700 from 500, but that's a small country, right? The actual number is thought to be far higher. In one region of Belgium, over 30% of euthanasia cases were carried out with the consent of the victim. In 70% of those cases, euthanasia was not even discussed with the patient, and most of the patients weren't terminally ill. They simply had a condition that they were being treated for in other ways, where there was hope of a cure.